Europe is currently facing one of its peak holiday periods, with Australians flocking over for a nice summer holiday. But over-tourism has become a growing discussion. And that's the phenomenon where a mass number of people visit a specific location, putting a strain on local resources.
We know that tourism can boost local economies. However, we also know that it can harm cultures and disrupt locals' lives. So what are the effects of over-tourism and how can it be tackled?
I'd say one of the best parts of this podcast is bringing on new members of the TDA team to come and bring stories that they've been writing to everyone listening, on their way to work or in the car or at home. Nandini, welcome to your first podcast.
Thank you. I'm so excited. I've been hearing lots of headlines about what's been happening in the world of tourism, what's been happening overseas, and seeing friends overseas. So I thought it was a good time to talk about it.
I think this is a really interesting topic. There is some slight irony in us talking about it at this time of the year. This is when a lot of Australians, head to the Northern Hemisphere to get some sun. But it's not all good news, is it?
No, not exactly. So this year alone, we've seen Barcelona residents spraying tourists with water guns. In Mallorca, over in Spain, residents have been protesting about tourist caps. And they even put up a screen in Japan to cover a view of Mount Fuji in order to deter tourists from taking photos.
And I guess what we're getting at here is this negative impact that over-tourism can have on local cities or towns through this dilution of culture or traditional ways of living. And this really can cause a bit of friction between residents and tourists. But this doesn't feel like it's a recent issue to me, is it?
Not really. It's not a new phenomenon at all. And I think about places like Bali. It's an island that's practically dedicated to hosting tourists, and it's been facing over-tourism for years. Last year, Australians made nearly 1.4 million trips to Indonesia, and almost 90% of these trips were for a holiday, and that's according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics.
And we can't forget as well that tourism does bring some good. It brings benefits. It boosts local economies. There are jobs, and there are entire cities and towns that rely on the tourism economy for employment. And there's also that growth and development aspect for local areas. But I guess this discussion is more about the downsides of over-tourism. So what are the issues then that we're going to focus on?
While tourists can bring a lot of money to local economies, in instances where we have over-tourism, that can increase demand in the small area. And basically, it will drive up prices, leading to inflation. I actually spoke to Larry Dwyer. He's a professor at the University of Technology, Sydney, and he's an expert in tourism and economics. And here's what he told me.
Economically, people think that tourism's good for an economy, but if you're not in the tourism industry itself, you might suffer from inflation because of the extra demand. This is what's happening now in many cities in Europe as the locals in Venice and Barcelona and so on are seeing that their living standards are being eroded by tourism.
So we know that over-tourism can drive up costs of things like flights and accommodation, and it can also lead to overcrowding at popular attractions.
Well, I feel like sometimes that overcrowding can just be extended to Australians, the overcrowding of Australians. It feels like whatever club you're in the world, whatever cafe, there's always going to be an Aussie, even if it's in the middle of Slovakia or South Africa. It feels like they're everywhere.
Absolutely. And, it got me thinking on whether overcrowding at popular tourist attractions would actually make people not want to travel there.
So if the idea of something having too many people or having too many Australians actually would make TDA readers not want to go there.
Exactly. And so we did a poll on Instagram where about 80% of our readers said that they care about large crowds of tourists when planning a holiday.
And do you think that kind of thing feeds into when people take their holidays?
Yeah. Around 10,000 people responded to our poll, and 95% of our readers said they would intentionally visit a tourist destination outside of peak travel periods purely to avoid crowds.
That's really interesting. I mean, that is an overwhelming response. And I'm sure there are other factors there, not just the overcrowding. Typically going to a tourist area at a really popular time of year is more expensive, and I'm sure there's a lot of that feeds into it too. But the fact that we have a clear sentiment from young people that they want to avoid these overcrowded areas is a change in the way that we think about travel. So what are the solutions then to all of this? I mean, if residents are unhappy, if prices are going up in areas where they shouldn't be, and then we've got tourists wanting to actually avoid the crowds as well, what's being done to tackle it?
Well, there are a couple of different methods that are being used or proposed around the world to try and address over-tourism. And one of them is tourist taxes, which places like Bali have already implemented. And the local government in Venice, Italy also implemented this, and they're set to double their tourist tax for next summer. And Professor Dwyer referred to this as a hip pocket nerve.
People don't like paying taxes. In Venice, there's been a tourist tax, but the locals say it's far too low. Anyone who goes to Venice can pay €5 for the tax. So taxes are one way of limiting numbers, but on the other hand, given that tourists are reasonably affluent, otherwise they couldn't afford to travel. Other ways may be better, crowd management types of techniques and regulations and so on.
Tourist caps are an example of trying to manage overcrowding in popular destinations. Essentially, it would involve putting a limit on the number of tourists in a certain area. And this is what residents are protesting about in Majorca. And the Spanish island has a local population of 1.2 million people, but they face around 18 million tourists a year. So it's no wonder that they're calling for a cap on visitors.
And there are often places that have those caps. In my experience, they've tended to be more around like big hikes or kind of more wilderness style parts of the world, like Patagonia, where they want only a certain number of tourists each year. It would be interesting to see if that actually extended to cities. I mean, imagine if Bali had a tourist cap, for example. But if tourist caps were introduced and the number of visitors declined, wouldn't that then hurt the local economies?
If tourism came to a complete halt, yes. I mean, we got a taste of this during the pandemic where the entire tourism industry took a hit and residents' livelihoods who depend on tourism were heavily impacted.
But I guess what you're getting at is more of what can we do to balance this out?
Yeah, exactly. I asked Professor Dwyer what an ideal balance of tourism, positive economic growth and residential well-being would look like. And he spoke about this idea of tourism degrowth, which is reducing the size of global travel. Ideally, this would put less strain on local communities and it would prioritise the well-being of residents. It would also reduce the environmental impacts of travel, like carbon emissions which are produced from flying.
If you downsize tourism, hopefully alongside other industries which should downsize, maybe the planet won't burn up as quickly as it has been. If this can be done in a slowish fashion, you'd be placing more emphasis then on the quality of life.
So is he basically saying there that he would want people to be travelling still, but just not as far from their original destination?
It's a combination of that, but also just reducing how much we travel. So there was an interesting thing I came across, which was at the moment, you might go to Europe, try and cover 6 countries in 2 weeks.
Okay.
Instead, why not go to one country and spend 2 weeks just there, exploring that singular area?
So it's interesting. It's actually getting then to the psychology of how we travel and like what is seen by especially young people as a successful trip. Is a successful trip one that involves 10 destinations over 20 days or one where you're actually staying in one spot? That is super interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of like a quality over quantity thing.
So what's your kind of, TLDR on all of this? Where are we left with?
So over-tourism isn't a new thing, but it's certainly growing. And this is why we're going to be hearing about it more. And it's going to come up more frequently in discussions, particularly as we try to tackle the climate issues associated with tourism. But that's going to open up a whole separate discussion for another day.
And I think there will be a couple more days where you're on this podcast, Nandini. It was so nice to have you here and so awesome for our audience to hear from another member of the TDA team. That was a sensational first episode. I'm so happy to have done it with you, and we'll hear from you more very soon.
Thank you. I had way too much fun.
And that's all we've got time for on today's podcast. I also hope that you had way too much fun with this episode. If you did, I'd love you to press follow or subscribe in Spotify, Apple. If you're watching on YouTube, then follow us on YouTube. We're really trying to bring you more content, and by pressing follow or subscribe, you're telling these big tech platforms that you like what we're giving you. We'll be back again tomorrow morning. Until then, have a great day.